Wind River Valley, Wyoming Territory, November 1834. Jonas Fletcher stood beside his first cabin as frost crept across the interior walls 3 feet from a roaring fireplace. The logbook beside his bed showed the arithmetic of failure. 4 cords of firewood burned each month, 3 times what it should take. His hands were raw from splitting logs. His back ached from hauling them. The cold seeped through walls, built the way every trapper built them, logs notched tight, mud packed between gaps, standard construction. By February, he would burn through more timber than 3 men should need for winter. Most mountain men accepted this as the cost of high-altitude living. Jonas Fletcher refused. What he developed over the next 3 years, a measuring system so simple it fit on a stick, yet so precise it cut timber waste by 1/4, would quietly reshape how trappers and early settlers built across the Rockies. The math of survival would decide who wintered and who left. The wind hit different at 8,000 feet. Jonas Fletcher learned that his first November in the Wind River Valley, when ice crystals formed on the inside of his cabin walls and his water bucket froze solid 3 feet from the fireplace. He had built the cabin the way every trapper in the Rocky Mountains built them. Logs stacked tight, mud packed between the gaps, stone fireplace at one end. Standard construction. Everyone did it that way. By February 1835, he had burned through more firewood than any 3 men should need for a winter. His hands were raw from splitting logs. His back ached from hauling them. Still, the cold seeped through those walls like they were made of paper. Worse, when spring finally arrived and the valley warmed, that same cabin turned into an oven. The thick log walls that could not hold warmth in winter somehow trapped every bit of summer heat, making sleep impossible and turning the interior into a sweatbox. Jonas was not alone in this problem. Every trapper, settler, and frontiersman building cabins in the mountains faced the same brutal reality. The standard cabin design that worked reasonably well in the lowlands and eastern forests became nearly unlivable in the extreme temperature swings of the high country. Summer days could hit 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter nights dropped to 30 below zero. The same structure had to handle both, and traditional construction methods failed at that task more often than they succeeded. Jonas Fletcher was not anyone special. Born in Virginia in 1809, he had worked as a carpenter's apprentice before the lure of the fur trade pulled him west. He joined a trapping brigade heading for the Rockies in 1833, part of that wave of young men chasing beaver pelts before the trade collapsed. He had some building experience, which was more than most trappers could claim, but he knew timber frames and board construction, not log cabins. The first structure he built in the Wind River Valley reflected that inexperience. He had picked a good spot, southern exposure for maximum winter sun, a cold spring nearby, timber close enough to haul logs without breaking his back. The valley walls provided some protection from the worst winds. Every practical consideration checked the right box. But when it came to actually building the cabin, Jonas made every mistake a first-timer could make. He cut his logs in late summer when the sap was still running. Didn't season them properly. Stacked them with the bark still on because removing it seemed like extra work. Used whatever chinking material was handy, clay from the creek bank, moss from the shaded areas, even grass stuffed in the bigger gaps. Built his fireplace on the north wall because that was where the ground was flattest. Constructed the whole thing in 3 weeks, proud of his speed. That cabin taught him lessons the hard way. The unseasoned logs shrank as they dried, opening gaps between them that no amount of chinking could permanently fill. The bark held moisture, encouraging rot and providing homes for insects. The clay chinking cracked during the first hard freeze, then crumbled away. The moss dried out and fell out in chunks. The grass-stuffed gaps became highways for mice. That north wall fireplace meant the fire's warmth flowed toward the coldest part of the cabin, while the living space stayed frigid. But the worst problem was something Jonas could not see or understand at first. The cabin had no thermal mass inside the insulated envelope. The stone fireplace sat against the outer wall, so half its warmth radiated uselessly to the exterior. The log walls themselves conducted heat away faster than the fireplace could replace it. On the coldest nights, Jonas could literally watch frost creep across the inside of the walls, despite keeping the fire roaring. Come summer, those same walls absorbed the day's heat and released it all night long, making sleep impossible. Jonas spent that first winter burning 4 cords of wood a month, 3 times what it should have taken. He spent the summer sleeping outside on the ground because the cabin was unbearable. He knew something was fundamentally wrong with how he had built the place, but he could not figure out what. The answer started coming together in the fall of 1835 when a Swedish trapper named Niels Bergström stopped at Jonas's cabin while passing through the valley. Niels had been in the mountains since the early 1820s, one of the old-timers who had seen everything and survived it all. He looked at Jonas's cabin with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what he was seeing. "You are cold here," Niels said. It was not a question. Jonas did not bother denying it. "Colder than I have ever been. Cannot figure why. Logs are tight, mostly. Got a good fireplace." Niels walked around the structure, studying it from different angles. He pushed on some of the logs, checked the chinking, looked at how the fireplace was positioned. Finally, he shook his head. "Your cabin is built backwards. You have made the fire warm the ground outside instead of the floor inside. The cold lives in your walls instead of staying where it belongs, outside." Jonas had no idea what that meant. Niels explained it in the straightforward way of someone who had figured out these principles through hard experience. Heat, he said, moved in specific ways. It radiated from hot surfaces like a fire or sun-warmed stone. It conducted through materials, faster through some than others, and it rose, which was why the ceiling area of any cabin stayed warmer than the floor. The problem with Jonas's cabin was that every one of these heat movements worked against him. The fireplace radiated half its warmth to the exterior wall, which conducted that heat straight outside. The rising heat escaped through gaps near the roof line that Jonas had not sealed properly. The log walls, which seemed solid, actually acted as moderate conductors, not terrible insulators, but not good ones either, and the cabin had no mass inside to hold warmth after the fire died down. "In the old country," Niels said, "we learned long ago how to keep warm. You build the heat storage inside the house, not outside. The fireplace must be in the center, or at least not touching the outer walls. The mass of stone must be surrounded by the warm air so it holds that warmth and gives it back slowly through the night." He went on to explain that the best cabins he had seen in the Rockies were built by trappers who had learned from their mistakes, usually after suffering through multiple winters. They positioned fireplaces in the interior when possible, or at least built them with significant mass extending into the living space. They used double-wall construction in the coldest areas, 2 layers of logs with packed earth or moss between them for insulation. They sealed every gap with proper chinking using materials that would not crack or fall out. And they built with properly seasoned logs that would not shrink and open new gaps. Jonas listened carefully. He had already started planning his second cabin to be built before the next winter arrived. Everything Niels told him contradicted the standard wisdom he had followed before. But that standard wisdom had left him freezing and miserable. He decided to try something different. Jonas spent the rest of that autumn and early winter thinking about everything Niels had told him. He thought about heat moving in different ways, about trapping air, about positioning the fireplace where its warmth would stay inside instead of escaping. He thought about double walls and proper materials. And he thought about his own carpentry background, which gave him skills most trappers lacked. But there was another problem Jonas had identified, one that Niels had not mentioned, but that Jonas's carpenter training made obvious. Every cabin he had seen suffered from inconsistent measurements. Trappers cut logs to approximate lengths, eyeballing dimensions, remeasuring repeatedly, creating endless offcuts and waste. A man building alone would measure a rafter length, cut it, then have to measure again for the next rafter. Errors accumulated. Timber piled up in the burn barrel. Jonas had a solution forming in his mind. By December 1835, Jonas had worked out a plan for a new cabin. He would rebuild from scratch using everything he had learned. The construction would take most of the following summer, but it would be worth it to have a structure that actually worked with the mountain climate instead of fighting it. Jonas started cutting logs in late fall of 1835 when the sap had retreated and the wood would season better. He cut twice as many logs as he would need for a standard cabin because his design called for double walls in critical areas. He let the logs sit through the winter, stacked with spacers between them to allow air circulation. By spring, when most of the moisture had left the wood, he began construction. But before he placed a single log, Jonas created his measurement tool. He selected a straight pine stick, approximately 4 feet long and 1 inch thick. Using a hot iron from his fire, he burned marks into the stick at specific intervals. The first mark, 6 inches from one end, represented the standard thickness for chinking gaps. The next mark, at 14 inches, showed the height of one log course. At 36 inches, he marked the standard length for interior bracing. At the opposite end, he burned marks for rafter spacing, window dimensions, and door frame measurements. Every repeated dimension in his entire cabin design was burned into this single stick. Jonas called it his Mark Once ledger, a reference to the account books he had seen merchants use, where a single entry recorded information used multiple times. With this tool, he would never need to remeasure standard dimensions. He would never create errors from inconsistent measurements. He would never cut a rafter, then have to measure again for the next one. The efficiency was immediate. When Jonas needed to cut logs for the inner wall, he placed his ledger stick against each log and marked at the 14-inch burn. Every log was identical in length. When he needed to space rafters, the ledger stick showed him exactly where each one should sit. When he cut bracing for the interior, every piece matched perfectly. The burn barrel stayed half empty. The first major change was the foundation and floor. Jonas's original cabin had sat directly on the ground with a packed earth floor. The new design incorporated stone foundation piers at the corners and midpoints, raising the entire structure about 2 feet off the ground. This created a crawl space that served multiple purposes. It kept the bottom logs from ground moisture and rot. It provided a buffer of air between the cold, earth, and the living space. And it allowed Jonas to store items that needed to stay cool in summer, but protected from deep freezing in winter. The floor itself was made from split logs, puncheons laid flat side up over thick support beams. This created an actual wood floor, which was much warmer underfoot than packed earth and provided better insulation from the cold below. The air gap in the crawl space combined with the mass of the wood floor created a thermal buffer that kept the living area noticeably warmer. The second major change involved the walls themselves. Jonas built the main structure with large, carefully fitted logs. Each one was debarked and hewn flat on top and bottom where they contacted each other. This was more work than using round logs, but it created much tighter joints with fewer gaps to chink. But he did not stop there. For the north and west walls, the sides that faced the prevailing winter winds, Jonas built a second wall 2 feet inside the main wall. This inner wall was made from smaller logs, also hewn flat. The 2-foot gap between the walls was filled with a mixture of materials, dried moss at the bottom, then a thick layer of dry leaves and forest duff, then more moss, then a final layer of clay mixed with grass. The idea was to create multiple layers of trapped air and insulating material. Using his Mark Once ledger, Jonas ensured that every log in both the inner and outer walls was cut to identical length. The precision eliminated the need for custom fitting and reduced the pile of offcuts that typically accumulated during cabin construction. Where a standard cabin build might waste one log in 4 to poor measurements and inconsistent cuts, Jonas's system reduced waste to 1 log in 20. That difference represented saved labor, saved timber, and ultimately saved warmth, because every log that did not end up in the burn pile could be used for firewood instead. The east and south walls did not get the full double wall treatment because they faced the winter sun and less severe weather. But Jonas chinked these walls much more carefully than his first cabin, using a specific recipe he had developed. The base layer was small split wood pieces wedged tightly into the gaps. Over this went a mixture of clay, sand, and cow hair. He traded for a bag of hair trimmings from a settler's ranch down valley. The hair reinforced the clay, preventing cracks. The sand added structure, and the clay provided the seal. But Jonas added one more element to his chinking recipe: lime. He had learned from another trapper that mixing a small amount of lime into clay chinking made it more resistant to water damage and cracking. The lime created a mild chemical reaction that hardened the mixture and made it more durable. Jonas did not understand the chemistry, but he understood results. His chinking, with its wood backing and lime-enhanced clay-sand-hair mixture, proved remarkably durable through temperature swings and weather. The Jonas' third major change was the fireplace and chimney. Instead of building against the outer wall, Jonas positioned his fireplace in the interior, about 4 feet from the north wall. He built the firebox and hearth from carefully selected stones, flat ones for the firebox floor, rounded river stones for the upper structure. But the key feature was the mass. Jonas built the fireplace structure much larger than strictly necessary for the firebox itself. The stone chimney was thick and wide, creating significant thermal mass inside the cabin. He extended stone benches out from each side of the fireplace, creating places to sit that also served as additional heat-storing mass. The entire structure probably weighed 4 or 5 tons of stone, all positioned in the interior of the cabin where its stored heat would radiate into the living space. The design principle was straightforward: fire a hot blaze for an hour or two, heating all that stone. The stone absorbed the heat, then slowly released it over the next 8 to 10 hours. This meant Jonas could let the fire die down to coals or even go out completely, and the cabin would stay warm from the radiant heat of the stone mass. He had effectively built a battery for warmth, charging it up periodically rather than maintaining a constant fire. The fourth major element addressed ventilation and seasonal adaptation. Jonas built small openings near the roof line on opposite walls, east and west. In winter, these stayed closed with fitted wood plugs sealed with clay. In summer, he removed the plugs, allowing hot air to rise out of the cabin naturally. This created airflow that made summer temperatures much more bearable. He also designed the roof differently than standard cabin construction. Most trappers' cabins had low-pitched roofs that barely shed water. Jonas built a steeper pitch which served multiple purposes. It shed snow more effectively in winter, preventing dangerous loads from building up. The steeper angle created more space between the ceiling and the roofline, adding an insulating air gap, and it allowed him to add a layer of sod over the split wood shingles, creating additional insulation and thermal mass. The sod roof was something Jonas had seen used by settlers on the plains, adapted for the mountain environment. He laid split cedar shakes as the base layer, then spread several inches of clay over them as a moisture barrier, then added a thick layer of good soil held in place by wooden frames at the eaves. Grass and wildflowers grew in this soil, their roots binding it together. The result was a living roof that insulated beautifully, absorbed summer heat before it could penetrate the cabin, and held winter warmth inside. Construction of the new cabin took Jonas most of the summer of 1836. Other trappers passing through the valley watched his progress with interest and skepticism. Building with double walls seemed like unnecessary work. The massive interior fireplace looked strange compared to the standard end wall placement. The sod roof drew particular comments. Most trappers thought it would leak or collapse. Jonas ignored the skeptics and kept working. His Mark I ledger stayed beside him constantly. When he needed to cut window frame pieces, the ledger showed him the exact dimensions. When he spaced roof rafters, the burn marks gave him perfect intervals. When he built interior shelving, every shelf matched the dimensions of every other shelf. By early September, he had finished enough of the structure to move in, though he spent the next few weeks completing details and fine-tuning the chinking. The first real test came in October 1836, when an early cold snap hit the valley, dropping nighttime temperatures below zero. Jonas lit his fireplace in the afternoon, building a hot fire that ran for about 2 hours. The stone mass heated up, radiating warmth throughout the cabin. By evening, when the fire had died down to coals, the interior temperature was noticeably comfortable, warm enough that Jonas did not need his heavy coat, something that had never been true in his old cabin. He let the fire go completely out around midnight and went to sleep. When he woke at dawn, his breath still formed mist, but the cabin was nowhere near as cold as it should have been. The stone fireplace was still warm to the touch. The walls showed no frost on the interior. The temperature had dropped certainly, but much more gradually than in his old structure. Jonas relit the fire, and within 30 minutes the cabin was warm again. The real test came in January 1837 when the deep cold settled in. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero for several days running. Jonas ran his fireplace routine, hot fire for a few hours each afternoon and evening, then let it die down overnight. The massive stone structure held warmth through the night. The double walls prevented cold from penetrating from the north and west. The tight chinking eliminated drafts. The raised floor kept ground cold from seeping up. Jonas burned less than half the firewood he had used the previous winter, and the cabin stayed dramatically more comfortable. He could work on projects inside without gloves. He could sleep without piling on every blanket he owned. He kept detailed records in a small ledger, noting daily temperatures, firewood consumption, and observations about the cabin's performance. The numbers told a clear story. Winter 1834 to 1835. 4 cords of wood per month, 24 cords for the 6-month heating season. Winter 1836 to 1837. 1 1/2 cords per month, 9 cords for the same period. The difference was remarkable enough that other trappers who visited immediately wanted to know what he had done differently. Word spread through the Wind River Valley and beyond. Other trappers began incorporating Jonas's techniques into their own cabins. Some used the double wall construction. Others focused on repositioning their fireplaces to create interior thermal mass. Most started using his chinking recipe, which proved more durable than the standard clay and moss approach. But the Mark I's ledger generated particular interest. A French-Canadian trapper named Remy visited Jonas's cabin in the spring of 1837 and watched Jonas mark out logs for a storage shed using the burned stick. Remy immediately grasped the efficiency. "How much timber do you save?" Remy asked. Jonas considered. "A quarter, maybe. 1 log in 4 that used to go in the burn pile now goes in the build or the firewood stack." Remy borrowed the ledger and examined the burn marks carefully. "I can make one of these." "That is the idea," Jonas replied. Within months, Mark I's ledgers appeared across the trapping community. Each builder made his own, customized to his preferred dimensions and building style. A trapper building a small 10-foot by 12-foot cabin needed different measurements than one building a larger structure. But the principle remained identical. Burn your repeated measurements into a stick once, then use that stick throughout the entire build. The efficiency gains compounded. A trapper working alone could complete a cabin in the same time it had previously taken 2 men. The reduction in wasted timber meant less time spent cutting and hauling logs. Less waste meant more wood available for fuel. More wood for fuel meant less time spent in the dangerous, exhausting work of firewood production during winter. By 1838, several cabins in the valley featured variations on Jonas's design. A pair of brothers from Kentucky built their fireplace dead center in their cabin, creating a stone mass so large it stayed warm for over 24 hours after the fire went out. An older trapper named Samuels added the sod roof technique to his existing cabin, reporting that it made a noticeable difference in both summer and winter comfort. The specific combination of techniques varied based on each person's needs, available materials, and building skills, but the underlying principles remained the same. The summer benefits of Jonas's design became apparent during the hot months of 1837. While other cabins turned into ovens, Jonas's structure stayed noticeably cooler. The sod roof absorbed heat before it could penetrate. The thick walls with their trapped air layers prevented heat from conducting inward. The high ventilation openings allowed hot air to escape. And the stone fireplace, no longer used for heating, actually helped cool the space. The massive stone stayed cool from the winter months and slowly absorbed summer heat, preventing temperature spikes. Jonas discovered he could enhance the summer cooling by opening his door early in the morning when the outside air was coolest, letting that cool air flow in and displace the warmer interior air. By mid-morning, he would close everything up, trapping the cool air inside. The thermal mass of the walls and fireplace then kept the interior comfortable through the hot afternoon. In the evening, he would repeat the process, purging accumulated heat and bringing in cool night air. The passive climate control worked remarkably well for a design created with no formal engineering knowledge. Jonas had simply observed how heat moved, learned from people who had solved similar problems in different ways, and combined those lessons into a functional design. The result was a cabin that maintained relatively stable interior temperatures despite extreme exterior swings. The broader impact extended beyond individual comfort. Better insulated cabins required less firewood, which meant less time spent in the dangerous, exhausting work of cutting and hauling logs. This gave trappers and settlers more time for other activities, tending livestock, improving their land, or simply resting. Reduced firewood use also meant less impact on local forests, which were already under pressure from overuse. Warmer, more comfortable cabins contributed to better health outcomes as well. Constant exposure to cold, as Jonas had experienced his first winter, stressed the body and increased vulnerability to respiratory illnesses. Cabins that maintained more stable, warmer temperatures reduced that stress. While frontier life remained harsh and dangerous, small improvements in daily living conditions could accumulate into meaningful differences in survival and quality of life. The social aspect of Jonas's innovations deserves mention. By sharing his techniques freely with other trappers and settlers, he contributed to a tradition of mutual aid and knowledge exchange that characterized mountain communities. Building a cabin that worked properly meant the difference between surviving winter and freezing to death. People shared survival knowledge because everyone's life depended on it. Jonas's willingness to explain his methods, to help others understand the principles rather than keeping them secret, reflected that communal approach to frontier living. Some of the trappers who learned from Jonas went on to build cabins in other regions, spreading the techniques further. A group of trappers who wintered in the valley in 1838 later built cabins in Montana Territory, incorporating the double-wall design. Settlers heading to Oregon country in the early 1840s sometimes stopped in the Wind River Valley and received advice on cabin building from Jonas and others. The knowledge dispersed gradually through the informal networks that connected mountain communities across thousands of miles. The specific techniques also continued adapting to different environments and materials. In regions where stone was scarce, builders used adobe bricks or thick-packed earth for thermal mass. Where timber was limited, they used smaller logs and thicker insulation layers. In Danjiao's areas with different climate patterns, less extreme temperature swings, or different precipitation, the designs shifted accordingly. The underlying principles remained, but the implementation varied based on local conditions and available resources. Jonas himself continued refining his approach over the years. He added a small attached greenhouse on the south side of his cabin in the late 1830s, using it to extend his growing season for vegetables and provide additional passive heating in winter. He experimented with different chinking materials, eventually settling on a recipe that included small amounts of tallow for water resistance. He built a second stone fireplace for summer cooking, located outside to prevent heating the cabin unnecessarily in hot weather. By the time Jonas was in his 50s, his cabin had become something of a showpiece in the valley. Jonas Fletcher stayed in the Wind River Valley until 1843. The fur trade was dying, but he had come to love the mountains and the valley where he had learned his hard lessons about cabin building. He eventually married a Shoshone woman, Morning Crow's cousin, and they raised 3 children in that carefully built cabin. He made his living guiding settlers through the mountain passes using knowledge he had gained during his trapping years. The cabin itself stood for over 40 years. It survived countless winter storms, summer heat waves, and the wear of daily use. When Jonas finally abandoned it in the 1860s to move closer to one of his grown children, the structure was still solid. Logs intact, chinking holding firm, stone fireplace as sound as the day he had built it. Other settlers used it for years afterward, recognizing the quality of its construction. The techniques Jonas developed and shared were not revolutionary in the sense of being entirely new. Double wall construction, interior thermal mass, proper chinking, passive ventilation, all these methods existed in various forms throughout different building traditions. What Jonas did was combine them specifically for the extreme conditions of high-altitude mountain living, adapting knowledge from Scandinavian log building, indigenous construction methods, and practical carpentry. The real innovation was recognizing that a cabin did not have to be just a box made of logs. It could be designed to work with natural heat flows, to store and release warmth strategically, to adapt to seasonal changes. This required understanding some basic principles of heat transfer, radiation, conduction, and convection. Even if Jonas never knew those formal terms, he understood them through observation and experience, learning from his own mistakes and from people who had solved similar problems in other contexts. The Mark Once ledger represented something equally important: the recognition that precision in construction was not merely aesthetic, but functional. Consistent measurements meant better fitting joints. Better fitting joints meant fewer gaps. Fewer gaps meant better insulation and longer structural life. The efficiency gained from eliminating remeasurement saved time and materials, resources that could mean the difference between survival and failure on the frontier. The legacy of this practical building knowledge continued through generations. Children who grew up in well-built cabins learned the principles behind the design. They carried that knowledge to their own building projects, sometimes improving on what they had learned, sometimes simplifying for different circumstances. The oral tradition of sharing building techniques meant the knowledge remained alive and adaptable, even without written documentation. The transition from the trapping era to settled agriculture in the 1850s and beyond brought new approaches to building, but many of the lessons from the trapping days remained relevant. Farmers and ranchers building permanent homes in the mountains still faced extreme temperature swings. They still needed structures that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. The specific techniques evolved. Sawmills made dimensional lumber available. Manufactured materials provided new options. Better tools allowed more sophisticated construction. But the fundamental principles of working with climate rather than fighting it remained applicable. Jonas died in 1871 at the age of 62, having lived far longer than most mountain men of his era. He had seen the beaver trade boom and collapse. He had witnessed the transformation of the mountain wilderness into settled territory. He had watched railroads cut through valleys where only game trails had existed. In his later years, Jonas sometimes guided young builders who asked for advice on cabin construction. He would share what he had learned, explaining about double walls and thermal mass, about proper chinking and seasonal ventilation. Some listened carefully. Others nodded politely and built whatever was quickest and easiest. Jonas did not worry about it. He had learned that people had to be cold enough times, had to burn enough extra firewood before they would put in the effort to build properly. But for those who did listen and apply the principles, the reward was immediate and lasting. A cabin that stayed warm in winter without burning excessive firewood. A structure that remained cool in summer without requiring constant attention. A home that worked with the environment rather than fighting it. The hearthstone from Jonas Fletcher's original cabin still marks the site in the Wind River Valley, half buried by soil and time, but solid. What choice would you have made on that day? Share your thoughts in the comments. Practical stories keep this history alive.